Sometime in January, I started having nightmares about the 20th century Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. And this was the beginning of an unhealthy obsession. The bald head, the jutting chin, the clown-like character that seduced a nation became a fixture of my waking imagination as well as my sleeping one. I started with an old biography, a new biography, his autobiography, and the books that influenced him most. And yeah, spoiler alert, the guy was a real butthole. But I felt like I was still only skimming the surface, and this reading didn't really cure me of my obsession. So seeing as winter in the UK is well shit, I decided to fly to Italy to cure my curiosity with some exposure therapy. Today, the city of Milan is best known as the Italian capital of finance and a world capital in high fashion and high society. Partly as a result, it has entirely escaped an accurate reputation as the birthplace of fascism. Immediately following the First World War, around 24 organisations had sprung up across Italy, made up mostly of disgruntled ex-soldiers. Calling themselves Fasci di Combattimento, the leaders of these groups were invited to this square on the 23rd of March 1919 to form a new political movement. Many who gathered, though, didn't really know why they were here or what this political movement was supposed to stand for. What they did know was that they were angry. They retired to a nearby hall, overlooking the Piazza San Sepolcro, where this crowd of ex-soldiers, confused political agitators, and the newspaper man who had invited them founded fascism. The 31-year-old Benito Mussolini was editor of the well-read newspaper The People of Italy. He had previously served as the editor of the socialist newspaper Avanti, back when he was a rising star in the Socialist Party. But he was dramatically ousted from this first editorial role in 1914 when he had publicly opposed the party's anti-war stance, calling for Italy to enter the First World War. When Italy did join the war on the side of France and Britain against the Central Powers, Mussolini joined up too. The country suffered heavy casualties and received little of the spoils that their allies did in post-war treaties. There was a widespread feeling that Italian troops had suffered and died in a war and gotten nothing out of it, strong-armed and humiliated by their more powerful allies. Mussolini found himself humiliated too, wounded by a mortar round during a training exercise. He spent the rest of the war on his back, enduring months of treatment, having 44 shell fragments removed from his body, although historians have theorized that the extent of his injuries were later exaggerated. He returned to his Milanese newspaper filled with rage and a feeling of betrayal that chimed with what a lot of other young men were feeling at the time. According to colleagues, he wrote without research or referring to archive. Whatever he wrote came straight from his deranged dome, and if anyone interrupted him, he'd threaten to shoot them. A threat that had some weight because he was always armed. The little town of Folì was important to Mussolini. He was sent here as a teenager to attend boarding school after being expelled from his last school for stabbing another boy with a penknife. During his rule, Folì was given the honour of being named the Leader's City, and his impact on the town can still be seen today. The architecture in the tiny district of New Rome is littered with the dictator's aesthetic obsessions. A devotion to symmetry, repeated military symbols, white marble macho nudity, and callbacks to the glory days of the Roman Empire. In this war monument, the soldiers of the First World War are depicted like the holy martyrs of antiquity. Mussolini's own war experiences were presented in the same way. His extended hospital stay was spun into a modern version of the Saint Sebastian story, the Christian martyr, Roman soldier, and a human pincushion. The Italian veterans of the First World War were desperate to feel like they hadn't fought and died for nothing. Mussolini related to this and in many ways embodied this feeling. But more importantly, he understood that pain and humiliation could be translated into holy struggle and righteous violence. But Mussolini wasn't the only one who understood that there was beauty in blood. In 1914, Itala Films released the silent Roman epic Cabiria. It's a film that nearly no one today has heard of, but we are all living in the world it inspired. It was the first feature film to be shown at the White House, and its high-budget, large-scale set pieces were the inspiration for iconic silent films that followed. The epic also features the debut of cinema's first reoccurring character, Matista, an Italian version of Hercules, who would appear in dozens of films afterwards and inspire clones of his own. Shirtless, bald, and always folding his arms in macho poses, it's easy to see he inspired more than just other macho movie stars. But this is just a footnote compared to the film's most significant contribution to history. Cabiria features the first recorded use of the Roman salute. There is no evidence that this gesture was ever used by actual ancient Romans and was likely an invention of 19th century stage productions. The film's writer, Gabriele D'Annunzio, may have been responsible for its addition, and was definitely responsible for its leak into real life. Less than a year after the foundations of fascism were set, General Gabriele D'Annunzio led 2,000 men to invade and occupy Fiume. The liberal Italian government's failure to secure the city as Italian territory post-war was a terrible source of humiliation for veterans and patriots. D'Annunzio was sort of their most famous leader, so using his fame as a celebrated poet and daring aviator as well as general, he led an illegal invasion of the city on Italy's behalf and without its consent. They held the city for 15 months, renaming the territory the Regency of Carnero. The many Italian nationals living in Fiume called D'Annunzio their Duce, which is Italian for leader, and celebrated his arrival. What followed was a radical experiment in what a state could be in the 20th century. D'Annunzio treated the city like a personal playground. He delivered regular balcony speeches from the governor's palace, where he mixed the language of art, religion, politics, and military expansion. Inside the palace, he conducted decadent Roman feasts, where alcohol, food, and cocaine were consumed in absurd quantity. Out on the streets of the city, public life was dominated by military pomp and parades, uniting the faithful and intimidating any local opposition. And the Roman salute, ripped straight from his own historical fiction, became a real greeting in the makeshift kingdom. At the time, it might have just seemed like a madman run amok, but the Fiume Affair became a blueprint, not just for Mussolini, but for every dictator that followed him. D'Annunzio's experiment ended in the bloody Christmas of 1920, when the Italian army expelled D'Annunzio and his few remaining troops. The faithful were cut down by an Italian military blockade. and those that fought till the bitter end were killed in brutal urban combat, while their duce was nowhere to be seen, having fled the city in disgrace. When Mussolini came to power, he kept D'Annunzio around, allowing him to live in isolated luxury and visiting him in highly publicised newsreels, later saying that D'Annunzio was like a bad tooth. Either you pull it out or cover it with gold. Evidently, he settled on the latter. By 1921, the Fascist Party had grown from a ragtag group of disgruntled soldiers to a legitimate political party with representatives in Italian parliament. Mussolini was among them, observing the dysfunctional dithering of a democracy in decay. The government's failure to prevent the Fiume occupation and their inability to resolve nationwide strikes had made them incredibly unpopular. It seemed like a new, faceless prime minister was elected every couple of years, and the government was run by a small cabal of city-dwelling elites who were old, ineffectual, and out of touch. And this is the environment where fascism thrives, when democracy fails to live up to its promises of representation. Mussolini's supporters, in contrast, were young and highly visible, conducting large-scale rallies in provincial town squares. They weren't locked away in some inner sanctum, dithering in useless and interminable debate. They were out on the streets, taking the fight literally to Italy's internal enemies. At least that's how people saw it. As an elected official, Mussolini achieved basically nothing, mostly because he was leading a paramilitary organisation in a small-scale civil war. The Blackshirts marched through cities and rural towns, intimidating onlookers and attacking their political opponents. They assaulted and often publicly executed striking workers. This won them support from landowners and industrialists, but also the rural poor, who were tired of the endless strikes and labour disputes. Once again, this made the government that had failed to resolve these strikes look weak and ineffectual in comparison. Using his newspaper, Mussolini would advertise the dates and locations of his speeches. In 1921 alone, he gave hundreds of speeches across the country, especially in Po Valley, where fascist enthusiasm was already reaching hysteria. The Blackshirts attended in great number, rehearsed in the chants that made the speeches feel like a dialogue between leader and audience. He routinely had ununiformed plants in the crowd who would get people to join in with the chants and make them feel organic. Among Mussolini's new supporters was Achille Starace, who could be described as the perfect fascist, utterly enthralled by Mussolini and overly attached to the uniform and the power that came with it. He would work alongside Mussolini for the next 20 years. A fascist march to take the Italian capital by force was a feature of Mussolini's speeches long before it actually happened. He spoke about it in Parliament and out on the streets in front of his cheering, uniformed followers. Initially, he sort of referred to the march as something that might only be theoretical or a metaphor, making references to Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon. By October 1922, though, it became pretty obvious that plans for a march on Rome were all too real. Thousands of Blackshirts had gathered in the southern city of Naples and were slowly starting to make their way to Rome. They were mostly unarmed and undisciplined. This wasn't some grand military exercise, it was a mob set on storming the capital. The sitting Prime Minister, Luigi Facta, was ready to use the army to suppress the fascists and finally get rid of the man gunning for his job. But the King of Italy, Victor Emmanuel III, refused to sanction a military response, worried that authorizing one would turn this small-scale civil war into a full-blown one. Once it became clear, though, that the government was not going to suppress the march, it was transformed into a victory parade. The fascist mob marched closer to Rome in celebration. But Mussolini wasn't among them. He didn't lead the Blackshirts on horseback or storm the city gates. He was still hanging about in his newspaper headquarters in Milan. He arrived by train, only showing his face once his safety and his elevation to the office of Prime Minister were assured in writing by the king. Most of his supporters arrived the following day, reaching the capital on specially arranged trains by Mussolini. The march that actually occurred in Rome was a pre-arranged victory parade, little more than a pageant. In later propaganda, the March on Rome was celebrated as a grand revolution. The fascist dead were remembered with solemn parades, and Mussolini would appear in them, on horseback, in a conscious reenactment of a revolution that never really happened. As a tourist, the best thing about Rome is how the city's ancient ruins stand comfortably alongside the modern. What's less comfortable is that we have Benito Mussolini to thank for it. Everyone who visits Rome probably walks along this street, gawking at the pristinely preserved ruins of the ancient Roman forums on either side of it. But most will be unaware that Mussolini demanded its construction. Even less will know that the road was hastily built, necessitating the demolition of 40,000 square meters of densely populated city and the relocation of almost 5,000 residents. The road was completed in 1932, bridging the ruins of the Colosseum with Mussolini's headquarters and the balcony where he gave his speeches. He could now see the Colosseum from his window. He chose the opulent globe room of the Palazzo Venezia as his headquarters, placing an oversized and often cluttered desk right next to its gigantic fireplace, forcing visitors to walk the length of the massive room before they could reach him. Obviously, this was intentional. For Mussolini, everything was stagecraft. The regime kept the lights of his office on all through the night, adding weight to the well-publicized myth that he never slept. The museum that now occupies the building would prefer visitors to focus on its history as a residence for old popes, but the mosaics underfoot give the game away, with the fascist floor plan kept very much intact. The Fasces is the symbol from which fascism gets its name. It's the ancient Roman name for a bundle of sticks bound together with leather straps, often including an axe. It was a symbol of power, used by various governments throughout the 19th century as an ancient Roman callback. The statue of Abraham Lincoln is resting his arms on a pair of them, without axes, at his memorial, unveiled the same year Mussolini came to power. But Il Duce's adoption of the symbol as fascism's main logo spoiled the fun for everyone else. Unlike Germany's most infamous doodle, you'll still find these things hidden in plain sight across Rome. One of the city's best preserved landmarks is held up with fascist brickwork, still sporting the logo to this day. Its connection to ancient history is probably what has allowed it to survive so long, which was all in line with Mussolini's intentions. Connecting himself to history in order to strengthen his legitimacy and ensure his immortality. Self-help books were bestsellers in Italy around this time, and they were written in response to people's uncertainty about their role in an increasingly mechanized and image-focused world. Imagine that. And it wasn't enough to tend the same field that your daddy had, or work in the same factory. Men were expected to become unique individuals to have worth in society. These books were filled with advice on how to become a more dynamic person and stand out from the crowd. And yet, this was also the time where crowds and cults were empowered more than ever before. Mussolini walked into a time where these two sort of polar opposite cultural forces converged in a way that benefited him immensely. He was a unique character that people wanted to be like, but also an aberrant freak in both appearance and demeanour who provoked curiosity, fear, and devotion in equal measure. His first official biography, this one, became a bestseller in 1925. Written by Margareta Sarfatti, a Jewish journalist, art critic, and long-term mistress of Benito Mussolini. As propaganda goes, it's pretty well written, even as it fawns over her boyfriend as a heroic self-made man from page to page. It emphasises his humble origins as a blacksmith's son, and then follows his Machiavellian rise to power, but, it sees that as a positive thing, as a cool thing. It is the story of a badly behaved schoolboy transforming himself into a mythic hero. Written to be relatable and empowering, it mimics the self-help books that it was sold alongside. The success also kept Margherita in Mussolini's inner circle for another decade, later earning her the ironic and insulting title of the Jewish mother of fascism. During his first few years in office, Mussolini kept up the facade of democracy, but was always working to dismantle it. He defined parliamentary debate as decadent, calling it boring masturbation. He bypassed the Chamber of Deputies and the judiciary by passing legislation directly through decree, and he kind of made this all seem democratic, arguing that the state had become so unwieldy and unaccountable that it no longer served the people. His speeches were delivered directly to the gathered masses, serving as an alternative performance of democracy. When he spoke, he did so in sentences that often seemed completely disconnected from one another, delivered in varying tones and in staccato bursts, until they reached a crescendo of violent and infectious emotion that the crowds were just sort of swept up in. His speeches appeared improvised, even when they were rigorously rehearsed. He made crude jokes, insulted his opponents, and gave the crowd ample opportunity to respond. He told them that Italy was in a perpetual state of revolution. Despite being in charge, he painted himself as the underdog, fighting against the state's internal and larger foreign enemies, scapegoats for the crowds to rally against, aligning himself with the common man. A Mussolini speech was part sermon, part stand-up, and part mass hypnosis. Watching them with modern eyes, the preening poses and pantomime arm movements might seem cartoonish, but there is a subtle difference between caricature and icons. In the era of silent movies and crappy audio amplification, these exaggerated gestures didn't seem so absurd. In fact, they were the motions of a master conductor. He played the crowd like an orchestra, who through repeated attendance and exposure to his speeches in newsreels knew which chant corresponded to which movement. To many in Italy, this felt more democratic than the boring, private masturbation of parliamentary debate. Mussolini involving the crowd in the process, but really, they were just puppets in a performance.
And I see and recognize among you sons of your land as well as ours, my fellow citizens, who are working to make America great.
In 1924, Fascist Italy held its first and only multi-party election, a final staging of democracy before it was abandoned altogether. Blackshirts attacked opposition candidates and threatened citizens at voting stations. One opposition MP was brave enough to resist. Giacomo Matteotti stood against Mussolini, openly denouncing the election as fraudulent in a powerful speech to Parliament. 2 months later, his hastily buried body was found in the woods outside Rome. This sparked a major political crisis. Many convinced themselves that this scandal would finally unseat Mussolini and prevent him from consolidating power. Opposition MPs stormed out of Parliament, confident that this show of force would provoke the king to finally remove their tyrannical prime minister. In reality, this performative walkout only empowered Mussolini further, giving him full control over all legislative decisions. Fascist newspapers blamed the opposition for causing instability and told readers that only Mussolini could restore order. By 1926, all non-fascist parties had been banned. Leaders, or those who had resisted, were imprisoned, exiled, or forced into hiding. He declared himself Il Duce. In official acts, this title had to be written in capital letters. The state was the party, and the party answered to him. If people were still uncertain about what fascism actually stood for, now they knew. It was absolute monarchy reborn. Historically, dictators were able to control a nation's narrative by dominating headlines, discourse, and media channels. But modern propaganda is a lot more advanced than it was in Mussolini's day. Today, they can use social media channels, 24-hour news cycles, and bots to influence opinions. And that's why I use Ground News. It gives you a bird's eye view of all the narratives being pushed in and outside of the mainstream media. During a time when oligarchs and authoritarians are exerting more and more control over the information we receive, it's more important than ever to check out the information that is being spread outside of your bubble. I've relied on my partners at Ground News for a long time to help me sort fact from propaganda. And they're not some shadowy empire that influences or amplifies certain narratives. They're an independent app and website that gathers every perspective, reporting on stories shaping our lives, and then adds insight on the biases, credibility, and even the financial incentives behind the headlines. This way you can compare coverage, question narratives, and see what's really happening in the world at large. Ground News is how I found out about the Trump administration quietly lifting restrictions on their ability to conduct airstrikes, allowing them to strike a broader range of targets, including cartels south of the border. And this story was nearly completely missed by the left-wing press, as it coincided with the media storm that occurred during Zelensky's visit to the White House. So escape your echo chamber and cut through the narratives that are being thrust upon you. For a limited time, you can use the same plan I use. Just go to ground.news/OT to scan this QR code to save 40% on their unlimited access Vantage plan to see what's really going on. You can have more informed conversations, call out one-sided narratives, and think more critically about the world for just $5 a month. I think you'll find Ground News to be as valuable as I do. Now that they were in a position of supreme power, the fascist party set upon a series of reforms to transform Italian society in its own image. From his high position of National Party Inspector, Achille Starace obsessively pushed petty rituals and bizarre customs to become a part of public life. He started in the schools, instituting a Roman salute to the war dead at the beginning of lessons. These children were raised in Starace's world, where foreign words were frowned upon, where salutes replaced handshakes and uniforms were inspected with obsessive rigor. Later on, Starace even insisted that loyal fascists should adopt a specific kind of walk, a rigid stride that should be adopted in daily life, not just during parades. Discipline and respect for the regime were now at the centre of this new Italian life, but it was secretly detested. Mussolini was widely popular, but the enforcement of these rituals conflicted with the easygoing Italian lifestyle that most people led. But fascism attracted and empowered others like Starace, men who believed in nothing but the submission to hierarchical power. It was men like this who made up Italy's secret police, who monitored society from the shadows, spying on anyone suspected of anti-fascist activities and maintaining fascist rituals through fear and intimidation. Bologna is my favourite city in Italy. Known as the food capital of the country for good cause, it's also famous for its terracotta-tinted streets and vibrant medieval history. The city was a centre of education, art and political freedom, among the first on earth to abolish serfdom in 1256. Since then, Bologna has been ruled by kings, popes, lords, emperors, some nobles, a few presidents, and a duce. But Mussolini's rule nearly came to an early end on Bologna's streets, the last of several assassination attempts that he miraculously and unfortunately survived. Solidifying himself as dictator came with consequences, as those who opposed him now saw violence as the only solution. On November 4th, 1925, he survived an attempt in Rome, when a former Socialist Party member attempted to shoot him from a hotel window. Less than a year later, a wealthy and mentally unstable Irish woman successfully shot Mussolini in the face, but the bullet only grazed his nose, providing the regime with a perfect piece of propaganda. The sight of Mussolini's face, bandaged up and calmly smiling, cemented him as a man of providence. 5 months after the second attempt on his life, a bomb was thrown under his car but failed to detonate, cementing the notion that his survival was divinely ordained, given special significance with how public the spectacle was. And this was outdone by a fourth and final failed attempt. When visiting Bologna, Mussolini was fired on during a parade, as he was making his way to the main square to give a well-attended speech. The mob believed they had found the culprit minutes after the shot was taken. The apparent assassin? A 15-year-old boy named Anteo Zamboni, who was overpowered and lynched on the spot. The evidence that Zamboni was indeed guilty was spare and contradictory, but on the day, the crowd didn't care. They'd celebrated the killing as divine, democratic justice, ordained by the man they had gathered to worship. The man who had taken power by force, who had abolished the free press and the right to vote. Modern democracy isn't as old or stable as we like to think. Universal suffrage in the UK isn't even 100 years old. Compared to Imperial Rome or the eunuch-run bureaucracies that kept Chinese dynasties standing, the political system most of us live under is basically a teenager. The Soviet Union couldn't clear a century. The so-called 1,000-year Reich ended up lasting 12. Meanwhile, the market streets of Bologna date back to before the 11th century and have been in continuous use ever since. Anyone alive today has already acquired crowd immunity to the power of images. Bombarded with ads, art, and propaganda, they are an unconscious part of our everyday life. And even now, they can have a terminal effect. So imagine what it was like for the average Italian in the 1920s when the mass production of images began. They were born during the golden age of postcards, which for the first time gave even the poorest citizen the ability to display mass-produced images in their home. The Fascist Party flooded this market with pictures of Mussolini in different poses, situations, and outfits, frequently depicted driving automobiles and piloting aircrafts, associating him with the most exciting technology of the day. Cinemas were opening for the first time across the country, and every showing was preceded by newsreels with Mussolini depicted as the country's leading man. Items that he had used or touched were sold like they were holy relics. His face was printed on everything from bars of soap to swimsuits. The way the regime repeated his image in posters didn't just inspire other dictators, but modern advertisement and avant-garde art that came decades later. He was the first person with the technological opportunity and shameless will to turn himself into a national meme. But most of these images weren't designed to last. The postcards rotted, the newsreels were out of date in a week, and the posters peeled off in the rain. So as he aged, Mussolini became obsessed with permanence and cementing his place in history. This giant marble erection is the Mussolini Obelisk, constructed in 1932 to mark the 10th anniversary of fascist rule. Obelisks were a feature of the ancient Roman cityscape, many of which were stolen from ancient Egypt, and despite their pagan origins, Rome's leading pope still kept them standing, repurposing them to commemorate their own glory. Despite its own unsavoury origins, Mussolini's monument to his own manhood remains standing too, with the dictator's name and title preserved, greeting each visitor on their way to Rome's most popular sports stadium. It was, and I think still is, the largest block of unbroken marble ever extracted from the Alpine Alps, and then perilously transported via ox and boat to the Italian capital. The journey itself was a propaganda parade. And the parade goes on in a kind of fossilized form today, as all visitors heading to the Stadio Olimpico will march from the obelisk over these Mussolini-themed mosaics. His name, title, and initial are capitalized and repeated under your feet, and some are even being restored after years of foot traffic. The EUR District was meant to be Mussolini's masterpiece. Today it hosts the headquarters of a few minor government departments and luxury fashion brands. It sits a few miles south of where most tourists ever venture, and on wet weekends it is virtually deserted. It was originally built as the site of the 1942 World's Fair, doubling as a celebration of 20 years of fascist rule. But after the outbreak of World War II, the fair was scrapped, and Mussolini was deposed by his own Grand Council 1 year after it was supposed to occur. Today, the district feels like a ghost town, populated by the spirits of a Roman past that never was and a fascist future that never came to be. For me, though, it's a much more interesting place to visit compared to the overcrowded Colosseum or the spiritually vacant Vatican, sapped of all its supposed grandeur by the clatter of shuffling feet and telescopic selfie sticks. But I digress. The EUR District is more than just a window into Italy's fascist past, it is also an insight into its fascist present. Rows of posters have been plastered on walls, set up by a neo-fascist student association that operates out of high schools and universities. As I travelled around Italy, their logo followed me too, but it was losing the battle for wall space against far-left graffiti and whoever this guy is. Italy is covered in graffiti, Rome especially, and much of it is political, and nearly all of it sucks. It plagued cities in Mussolini's day too. Sentences from his speeches were reproduced on walls of the city he ruled. Political slogans and logos fought for space on any brickwork that wasn't ancient enough to demand historical reverence, and so it goes today. When resistance to the regime began in the early 1940s, the first visible defiance that many citizens saw was on the walls. At a time when the secret police would arrest anyone who dared to print anything that was critical of the government, graffiti was one of the safest ways to be heard. Suddenly, these flashy propaganda posters that had worked so well for decades looked forced and inauthentic compared to the scribbles of ordinary people who were risking their lives to leave them. The legacy of fascism, though, was harder to erase than spray paint. When Mussolini was deposed, there were tens of thousands of Romans who had worked for the regime who took no part in the resistance. They didn't want to completely tear down the history they were instrumental in building, and that's part of the reason why you'll still see things like this, hiding behind the scaffolding, a statue still sporting the Roman salute in plain sight. And just around the corner from that is one of the only remaining images of Benito Mussolini in modern Italy, sitting on his horse, surrounded by soldiers in a military victory that never happened. Modern Italy's relationship with its former leader is complex and is currently in a state of flux. When she was younger, the current Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni expressed admiration for Mussolini, distancing herself from these views when she entered mainstream politics, but there is no denying that her policies and style of speech betray a direct influence.
Io sono Giorgia, sono una donna, sono una madre, sono italiana, sono cristiana, non me lo toglierete!
Fully fledged neo-fascist organisations might be in a small minority, but membership has been swelling in recent years. Still, they are mostly a mix of angry, nostalgic old men and rebellious students who are more interested in offending people than actually seeking political office. Maybe one reason for this resurgence is simply because of what remains standing. Statues stick around for a lot longer than the people who suffered during their construction. The March on Rome happened over 100 years ago. The rubble's been swept away. The bodies have been buried, but the best of the era's architecture remains standing in a city that proudly preserves its past. Redapio is a small rural town in eastern Italy, home to just over 6,000 people, most of whom are old and unassuming. The place has a frankly menacing aura, mostly because its only claim to fame is being the hometown and final resting place of Benito Mussolini. Today, his childhood home is a minor tourist attraction. It was once an anonymous building on an anonymous hill, but in the 1930s, Mussolini commissioned the construction of this crown-like structure to serve as the new town square, positioning his birthplace as Predapio's sacred central jewel, burdening the quiet town with a legacy that it has never escaped. The imposing fascist party headquarters in the tiny town has been abandoned since the early 1940s. I tried to find a way in, but every possible entrance was locked or had rusted over decades ago. Its outer walls are covered in faded neo-fascist graffiti, left behind by Predapio's most enthusiastic tourists. Pilgrims mostly make their way here on Mussolini's birthday or for the March on Rome's anniversary. Enough of these guys make their way to Predapio throughout the year to maintain a market for Mussolini-themed mugs, wine, dress watches, socks, and, troublingly, truncheons. Displayed proudly in shop fronts are enough tacky pieces of Mussolini merch to boggle the mind. Basically, Predapio is a forgotten fascist theme park, and I was visiting in its off-season. During the peak of his power, Predapio was visited by legions of loyal fascists, who came to pay their respect at his home, and to the elaborate tomb housing the bodies of his parents. This rally occurred in 1937, and you can see his followers turned his birthplace into Bethlehem. Mussolini had just made good on his promise of imperial expansion. a promise that he'd been exciting crowds with since before he was even leader. Italy's invasion of Ethiopia then was a long time coming. It was a country that Italy had failed to invade in 1895, which was a bitter source of national shame. So Mussolini spent the early 1930s building up Italy's military and modernising it at great cost. The invasion itself was short and marred by war crimes. Ethiopia's emperor fled, and the country surrendered, with casualties in the hundreds of thousands. All so Italy could finally compete with other European nations as a real imperial power. But Italy's army suffered too, with some expensive, embarrassing equipment losses to boot.
When the Italian crew open their manholes for air, the Ethiopians, hiding in ambush, shoot them down. In this country, the heat inside a tank is sometimes nearly 200 degrees Fahrenheit.
The invasion of Ethiopia was in many ways just another grand propaganda campaign, providing the newsreels with footage of charging Italian cavalries and Italian fighter planes overhead. But it emptied the government's purse and gutted its ability to wage war against a major power. For Mussolini, image was everything. Often the performance of power was more important than power itself. But keeping Ethiopia under Italian rule came at even greater cost. The occupation required an enormous garrison of troops to stay put in Africa. Keeping them fed and supplied over a long distance stretched Italian supply lines to breaking point. So when the Ethiopians resisted their occupation, it led to brutal, disorganized crackdowns, mass executions, and the establishment of concentration camps. Britain and France publicly condemned the invasion, citing the use of mustard gas on civilians as barbaric. In reaction, Mussolini ordered Achille Starace to produce endless reels of anti-French propaganda. But alienating Italy from the rest of the world forced Mussolini to develop closer ties with Germany's new leader, a man who, on first impression, Mussolini thought was a total psychopath.
As the German Chancellor steps from the machine, he is greeted by Signor Mussolini. This is the first occasion on which these two famous dictators have met. Each holds in his hand the destiny of a great nation, and the whole world looks with eager interest on this meeting. For any momentous decision made by either of these men must affect the whole of Europe, if not the world.
Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini first met in Venice in 1934, and Hitler was immediately in awe of the man he had respected so much from afar. Mussolini was less impressed. He had long resented Hitler's theft of the Roman salute and the other obvious ways that he sought to emulate him. Together, they were greeted by legions of loyal Mussolini followers and military displays which impressed the German leader greatly. But their private meeting only confirmed Mussolini's irritation. The palace where they met was plagued with mosquitoes that day, and Hitler spoke extremely quickly and without pause, jumping from topic to topic in a language that Mussolini only had a passing knowledge of. In private conversations later on, Mussolini told associates that the Führer had all the mannerisms of a sexual degenerate. A bit rich, coming from a guy that apparently had up to 4 sexual encounters a day with different women. Women who claimed to be among Mussolini's mistresses confirmed that these were time-constrained affairs. I mean, he had a country to run. So Mussolini would satisfy himself in less than a minute, remaining clothed, only taking his obelisk out. By the time Mussolini visited Munich in 1937, he had been completely eclipsed by his former fanboy. His journey to Munich was a meticulously orchestrated state visit, designed to impress the founder of fascism by his own standards. Hitler's audiences weren't just adoring, they were captivated and loyal to the point of madness. Hitler's use of charged symbolism had reached the levels of religious worship. His troops were more disciplined, the technology far more advanced. This was fascism, but on a true industrial scale. The trip humbled Mussolini. He was aging, his health was ailing. Now alienated from Western Europe with an economy and military capacity weakened by his Ethiopian campaign. From a tactical perspective, he had no choice but to fall in line with this new, stronger leader. In public, he now completely abandoned any initial irritation he had with the Führer. Ultimately, the founder of fascism himself was susceptible to the same spell that he put his country under. Confronted with the discipline, fanaticism, and efficient war machine of Nazi Germany, Mussolini went from Il Duce to the Führer's lapdog. In 1938, just before the outbreak of World War II, Mussolini instituted anti-Jewish racial laws in Italy at Hitler's insistence, forcing his former mistress and biographer to flee the country she'd helped create, leaving her sister and brother-in-law behind, who were deported to Auschwitz and executed. Milan Central Station is, without argument, the greatest architectural masterpiece of the fascist era. But its greatest shame also occurred beneath its vaulted ceilings. Hidden away on the far side of Platform 21, you'll find one of the only surviving images of Mussolini in Milan, depicted here in another scene that never happened. You'll notice though that his eyes have been removed, rumoured to have been shot away by partisans when they finally liberated the city from fascist rule. On hidden platforms beneath the surface of the train station, thousands of Italian citizens were loaded onto trains and transported to Nazi death camps outside the country, all under the watchful eyes of their leader.
Dell'impero e del regno Cabiria, ascoltate, la dichiarazione di guerra è già stata consegnata agli ambasciatori.
Mussolini's declaration of war was as tactical and well judged as Italy's entire World War II campaign, which is to say, it was crap. In his usual theatrical style, he declared war on Britain and France, just as France was already collapsing under the German invasion.
La tua tenacia, il tuo coraggio, il tuo valore.
After commissioning years of anti-French propaganda, Mussolini couldn't pass up the opportunity of putting France to heel. Hitler, though, was furious and confused. He knew just how poorly prepared Italy was to enter the war. But also he didn't understand why Mussolini would publicly declare war before invading. He ended up paying the price for these theatrics. Italian troops encountered a prepared resistance in terrible weather conditions and lost thousands of men in just 5 days. Their lives were exchanged for the symbolic occupation of Menton, a French Riviera resort town of little to no strategic value. The only prize it offered was footage for the propaganda reels, with its abandoned casinos and the capture of its scenic coastline serving as proof of Italy's meagre but costly triumph. The Italian military didn't fare any better as the war went on, serving more as a liability to the Axis forces than a competent ally. The Italian invasion of Greece was a disaster. Mussolini launched the invasion without informing Hitler. Learning his lesson from the last time, he didn't announce it to anyone else either. He believed it would be an easy victory, independent of German assistance. On arrival, though, they encountered a well-trained and more than motivated resistance.
The Greeks advanced to harass the Italians in their precarious positions. At the eastern end of the line, the frozen skeletons of Italian aircraft litter the countryside, tributes to the gallant Greek Air Force and our own brave flyers. As in Libya, so in Albania, stores and equipment in huge quantities are left behind in the Great Retreat.
The Greeks easily outmaneuvered Italy and pushed them back into occupied Albania.
In the wild and rugged country of southern Albania, the Greeks are still pushing steadily forward after the retreating Italians. Ancient stone bridges destroyed by the fleeing Wops are replaced by wooden structures by Greek engineers,
forcing Hitler to delay his invasion of the Soviet Union and bail out the Italians instead. Many World War II historians point to this moment as maybe the turning point in the whole war. Had Germany invaded the Soviet Union sooner, they may have avoided the bitter Russian winter that halted the Nazi war machine in its tracks. The images all over Italy depicting Mussolini as a conquering hero now looked unintentionally ironic. The shameless proliferation of his own face was now actively working against him. Who was responsible for Italy's military failure? There was an answer on every street corner.
Blast on the left of the screen has struck the center tank. It spins around, disabled.
Italy's campaign in North Africa went just as poorly. Incompetent and increasingly unwilling Italian generals floundered against better equipped British forces.
There it goes.
Italy advanced into Egypt without securing supply lines, allowing the faster, more mechanized British army to capture Italian troops with little effort. When the Germans arrived to bail Italy out again, it was even more humiliating. From this point forward, Italian troops were largely under German command, where they were seen for the liability that they were. When word got back from the Eastern Front, the Italian people learnt that their troops were being treated like expendable inferiors by Hitler's forces. The war had brought them no pride or glory. All Mussolini had done was turn their sons into slaves and cannon fodder in the service of a foreign army. His days were numbered. Mussolini was also distracted by his own rapidly deteriorating health. The stomach pains that had plagued him since his time in the army increased in both frequency and severity. He attempted to hide this from his lackeys, but between meetings he would writhe on his office floor in agony. As the war went on, he avoided public appearances, and when he did appear, his speeches were sapped of the vitality that once characterized them. How could he pretend to be Italy's supreme leader when he was so clearly under the Führer's thumb? How could he pretend to be a man of providence ordained by God when Italy's war efforts had all been calamitous failures? And how could he keep the strong man act up when his body was so clearly failing him? With Allied bombing raids reducing sacred parts of the Italian capital to rubble, the writing was on the wall. Italy no longer had any appetite for war, and high-ranking fascist officials agreed. Members of the Grand Council, led by his foreign minister and his own son-in-law, conspired to depose him, while military figures simultaneously held talks with the king to have him officially dismissed. These plots culminated in a long recrimination session in the Grand Council, where Mussolini was confronted by the plotters. He endured their speeches, mostly in silence, trying to hide obvious signs of stomach pain. Once his former lackeys had said their piece, he was taken away secretly in an ambulance and imprisoned, moved between several secret locations over the course of about 2 months. By all accounts, his jailers treated him quite well. He was described as calm and accommodating, seemingly at peace with his downfall, wondering aloud to anyone who'd listen about how history would eventually redeem his overall legacy. And history, or at least Italian history, probably would remember him more charitably if it weren't for what happened next. Italy does 3 things better than any country on earth: coffee, hand gestures, and graveyards. Catholic guilt has inspired some of the world's best art and architecture, and it has also apparently moved the entire Italian population to house their formerly alive family members in fabulous style. Italian graveyards are enormous and unnerving, as they're the only ones I've been to where the dead stare back at you. But on the outskirts of Prodapio, you'll find an especially disturbing boneyard, as everyone here is buried according to the symmetrical vision of its most famous corpse. The remains of Benito Mussolini are an inconvenient hike from Predapio's town centre, but they are still probably the town's best tourist attraction. His crypt was recently renovated and reopened to the public, where it has attracted the usual crowd of Mussolini fanboys, who crowd the cemetery on his birthday, queuing up to show their respects with a salute. On any other day, though, you can descend the stairs by yourself and enjoy the spooky scenery without having to endure the stench of still living fascists. Well, not quite, as the crypt is guarded by a single neo-fascist volunteer at all times, who watched me and my camera like a hawk. The only way I could have gotten a colder reception is if I'd shown up with a shovel and a sex toy. The crypt itself is cramped with Mussolinis, with his parents, siblings, and a few children kept in opposing corners. But as in life, Benito himself takes centre stage, draped in the Italian flag and watched over by his own marble head. Trekking across the Italian countryside to stand before the body of Italy's most infamous citizen was a surreal experience, but his own journey to get here was even stranger.
The Allied invasion of the Italian mainland commenced. It was to prove the shortest invasion in history, for on that same day came the Italian capitulation and acceptance of the Casablanca terms of surrender.
As soon as the Italian government officially defected to the side of the Allies, German forces quickly occupied strategic areas in the country's north, forcing the king and the new prime minister to flee south, effectively cutting the country in two. Mussolini, though, was still nowhere to be found, but with the help of some spies and a few bribes, the Führer's forces found him. On September 12, 1943, a crack team of German commandos conducted a glider assault on a remote hotel located on the tallest mountain in central Italy. They immediately overwhelmed the 200 Italian guards and secured their valuable prisoner. Mussolini was photographed upon his rescue, or kidnapping, depending on how you see it, and he was then transported into one of the overloaded gliders, and after 2 days of travel, met Adolf Hitler at his Eastern Front headquarters.
Hitler's boyfriend, the deflated Mussolini, was carted off to Germany by plane following his rescue by Nazi paratroops.
At this time, Hitler was already effectively losing the war. And he was also in the throes of a pretty gnarly methamphetamine addiction, thanks to his doctor, who was just loading him up with the stuff. Crazy times. Great book, Blitz, if you ever get a chance to read it. Anyway, yeah, Hitler's mental faculties were probably shot at this point, so his decision to reinstate the Duce in a new North Italian Nazi puppet state, maybe you could blame that on the meth. The Italian Social Republic was a joke, window dressing for the German occupation. The Allies supported the southern kingdom of Italy, which eventually absorbed Rome and the shambolic remnants of the government Mussolini left behind. The hardcore fascists migrated north, taking their place alongside the man they still worshipped. Achille Starace was among them, but was so wildly unpopular as the face of fascist propaganda that he was forced to keep a low profile in Milan. Mussolini's son-in-law, who had been instrumental in the plot to overthrow him, tried to flee to Spain, but was captured and taken into fascist custody. At Hitler's insistence, Mussolini had him executed by firing squad, alongside several other high-ranking traitors who had served alongside him for decades.
Cadono Marinelli, Gottardi, Pareschi, De Bono, Ciano.
This alienated him from his daughter, who had begged for her husband's life, and sent Mussolini into a deep depression. He later recounted that upon hearing the shots being fired, he felt like he had died himself. With the Germans in charge and his health in stark decline, Mussolini had little else to do other than ponder his place in history. This did give him enough time, though, to write a follow-up to his highly successful autobiography. In a series of articles that became a single volume, he charts his own downfall, something that most dictators don't get a chance to do. And as a result, it's a weird read, full of delusional self-aggrandizement, but also a barely concealed sense of doom. He saves his most bitter recriminations for the king and the various traitors who orchestrated his downfall. But he also blames the Italian people themselves for not sticking with fascism when the going got tough. He writes that history will vindicate him and that a return to power was possible, but in private, he knew he was a dead man walking. For nearly another 2 years, Italy was plunged into a brutal civil war. Supported by the SS, Mussolini's forces waged an unforgiving campaign against the partisans and civilians that rejected his legitimacy. The man who promised Italian expansion and national glory was now responsible for tearing the country in two, and for standing by as a foreign army exterminated her citizens. This is Piazzale Loreto, an ugly, unremarkable urban island in central Milan, crowded by congestion and shaded by crappy corporate high-rises. The only reason anyone would come here is to get somewhere else, unless, of course, you know its history. This monument, sat between two roads on a poorly maintained patch of grass, was commissioned to commemorate 15 Italian resistance fighters. They had been prisoners, hand-picked by Milan's Gestapo, who were then taken here and shot dead as a warning to others. Their bodies were left to rot in the blistering August heat, next to signs that labelled them murderers. For the rest of the day, armed guards paraded commuters past the bodies, a piece of morbid theatre that Milan wouldn't forget or forgive. Less than a year later, Milan was a battlefield. A few electrical poles in the city's centre still display holes from the bullets and shrapnel. The Allies and partisans fought the few remaining fascists and liberated the city through intense urban combat. After victory was achieved, partisans rounded up any officials still loyal to the regime. Despite no longer holding any kind of power, Achille Starace was recognised as an infamous and ugly reminder of the old regime and was arrested. He was taken into custody on April 28th, but didn't stay there long, as the next day his captors told him they were going to take him to meet Mussolini. Driven through a city in celebration, Starace was escorted to the Piazzale Loreto. Pushed through a growing, heaving crowd at gunpoint, he was taken to the exact location where the partisans had been displayed and left to rot just a year before. Here's where he saw Mussolini for the last time. Beaten beyond recognition, his skull had been crushed by the angry feet of the crowd. Strung up by his feet, and displayed alongside the body of his mistress and several high-ranking officials. He had been captured the previous day, attempting to flee to Switzerland dressed as a German soldier. But once he was captured, a partisan executioner was sent to find him with the sole task of conducting a summary execution. If we judged him only by his final words, Mussolini's end could be seen as somewhat dignified. He opened his shirt and told his executioner to aim for his heart. But his actions spoke louder, as he did nothing to prevent Clara, his mistress, from jumping in the way of the first bullet meant for him. Their bodies were then driven south to Milan and dumped on the dirt, only strung up after the crowd had taken their revenge. In the shadow of his Duce's swinging body, Starace gave him a final salute, the same salute that he had forced on a nation, and then was shot in the back of the head and strung up alongside him. There is no plaque or any form of commemoration in place where Mussolini's body was famously put on display, though he might be happy to know there is still a giant M standing close to the exact spot. The petrol station is long gone. In its place is a 2-story McDonald's, where you can commemorate Mussolini getting curb-stomped with a 9-piece nugget meal. Initially, Mussolini was buried in a mass grave on the outskirts of the city. But a whole year later, nostalgic loyalists dug him up on Easter Sunday. They then moved the body from place to place, trying to avoid detection. When authorities eventually tracked him and the grave robbers down, the government entrusted the remains with a convent 12 miles north of Milan. His body was then secretly stashed in a closet for another 11 years. It wasn't until 1957 when the body's relocation to the family crypt was finally approved, and here he has been displayed ever since. History is a sequence of eternal returns. The phases in the lives of nations are measured in terms of decades, sometimes of centuries. These are the words that Mussolini decided to close his autobiography with. And they are the words of an egomaniac consoling himself with the possibility that history might still remember him favourably. But they are also the words of a man who had a profound understanding of human nature. He knew that societies had short memories, and that the same primal feelings he exploited in his journey towards power would outlive him, and that others would follow his blueprint. There's a case to be made that everything built by evil regimes should be torn down, but I don't think that case is strong enough. It's important to remember atrocities, of course, but it's equally important to remember that evil people can build beautiful things. Tyrants are cheered when they burn down the old order, because crowds were seduced by their image, strength, and stories. Benito Mussolini was a fascinating character that history cannot afford to forget.